The sun hung low over Dodge City like a dying ember, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Wyatt Keene adjusted his worn hat as he guided his weathered horse toward the hitching post outside Murphy's saloon. The leather of his saddle creaked with the weight of too many miles, too many towns, and too many memories he'd rather forget. At 43, Keene had the look of a man who'd seen more than his share of trouble. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of the night his world had burned down 3 years ago. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, held a wariness that came from learning the hard way that trust was a luxury few could afford. "Another town, another chance to disappoint myself," he muttered, dismounting with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than in any bed. The saloon doors swung open with a familiar creak, releasing the scent of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies into the evening air. Keene stepped inside, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. The conversations died down as heads turned to assess the newcomer, a ritual as old as the frontier itself. "What'll it be, stranger?" asked Murphy, the barrel-chested bartender whose Irish accent had somehow survived 20 years in Kansas. "Whiskey. The good stuff, if you've got it." Murphy poured a generous measure into a glass that had seen better days. "New in town? Just passing through. Looking for work, maybe a place to rest my horse for a few days." "Well, you picked an interesting time to visit Dodge City," said a voice from the corner. Keene turned to see a man in his 50s, well-dressed despite the frontier setting, with the soft hands of someone who'd never worked a day in the sun. "Name's Raymond Dunlop. I'm the mayor of this fine establishment we call a town." Keene nodded politely but didn't offer his own name. He'd learned that anonymity was often the best policy in new places. "Interesting how?" Keene asked, taking a sip of whiskey that burned just right. Dunlop's expression darkened. "We've been having some troubles lately. Fires, poisoned wells, livestock going missing. Folks are on edge. Sounds like you need a good sheriff. We have one. Jonas Fry. Good man. But even he's struggling with this particular problem." Dunlop leaned closer, lowering his voice. "See, the troubles all started when that cursed boy showed up in town." Before Keene could ask what he meant, the saloon doors burst open with such force that they slammed against the walls. A small figure stumbled inside, a boy, maybe 11 years old, his clothes torn and dirty, his face streaked with grime and tears. His dark hair hung in his eyes, but Keene could see the terror written across his young features. The entire saloon fell silent. "Please," the boy gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need help. They're coming for me." "Get out of here, Eli Porter," shouted a man near the bar. "You've brought enough trouble to this town." "Yeah, take your curse somewhere else," added another voice. The boy, Eli, looked around desperately, his eyes wide with fear. That's when his gaze met Keene's, and something passed between them. Keene saw something in those young eyes that he recognized all too well, the look of someone who'd been abandoned by the world, left to face the darkness alone. "I didn't do anything," Eli whispered, his voice breaking. "I swear I didn't." "Like hell you didn't." The voice belonged to a woman who'd just entered the saloon. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair and green eyes that blazed with fury and grief. "My brother disappeared the night you came to town, you little demon." "Clara, please," Mayor Dunlop said, moving toward the woman. "This isn't the place." "Isn't the place?" Clara Dunlop's voice rose to a near shriek. "My brother Thomas is gone, Father, gone, and it's all because of him." She pointed an accusing finger at Eli, who seemed to shrink into himself. Keene watched the scene unfold, his jaw tightening. He'd seen this before. A community looking for someone to blame, someone weak enough to bear the weight of their fears and frustrations. The boy was an easy target. "What exactly are you accusing the boy of?" Keene asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. All eyes turned to him. Clara's face flushed with anger. "Who are you to question anything? You don't know what this town has been through." "I know what I see," Keene replied calmly. "A scared kid being blamed for things that are probably beyond his control." beyond his control. Clara laughed bitterly. The night he arrived, the Hendersons' barn burned down. 2 days later, the Morrison well was poisoned. Last week, half of Samuel's cattle went missing, and now my brother— Her voice broke. Keene looked at Eli, who was trembling like a leaf in a storm. The boy's eyes darted between the hostile faces surrounding him, searching for any sign of kindness or understanding. "Where are your parents, son?" Keene asked gently. Eli's lower lip quivered. "Dead, sir. Both of them. Fever took them last month. So you're alone." The boy nodded, unable to speak. Keene felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he'd thought he'd buried along with his own family. He looked around the saloon at the faces filled with suspicion and hatred, all directed at a child who'd lost everything. "This is ridiculous," Keene said, standing up. "You're all acting like a bunch of superstitious fools blaming a kid for your problems." "You don't understand," Mayor Dunlop said, his voice taking on a warning tone. "Strange things happen around that boy. Unnatural things. The only unnatural thing I see is a town full of grown adults terrorizing an orphan child." Sheriff Jonas Fry chose that moment to enter the saloon, his hand resting on his gun belt. He was a tall, lean man with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. "What's all the commotion about?" "The cursed boy is back," someone called out. Fry's expression hardened as he looked at Eli. "Son, I thought I told you to stay away from town." "I was hungry," Eli whispered. "I just wanted some food." "Well, you can't stay here. It's not safe for you or anyone else." Keene had heard enough. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "The boy's coming with me." The saloon erupted in shocked murmurs. Clara stepped forward, her face twisted with rage. "Are you insane? He's cursed. He'll bring nothing but misery." "The only curse I see is the hatred in this room," Keene replied. He walked over to Eli and knelt down to the boy's level. "What's your name, son?" "Eli Porter, sir." "Well, Eli Porter, my name is Wyatt Keene, and if you want, you can come with me. I've got food and a safe place to sleep." Eli's eyes filled with tears, not of fear this time, but of desperate hope. You'd really help me?" "I would." Sheriff Fry stepped forward. "Mr. Keene, I appreciate your Christian charity, but you don't understand what you're getting yourself into." Keene stood up, his hand instinctively moving closer to his gun. "I understand perfectly, Sheriff. I understand that this town has decided to blame its problems on a child instead of looking for the real cause." "The real cause is standing right there," Clara shouted, pointing at Eli again. Keene looked at her with something approaching pity. "Ma'am, I've lost family too. I know what grief can do to a person, how it can twist your thinking, but this isn't the answer." He turned back to Eli and extended his hand. "What do you say, son? Want to get out of here?" Eli looked around the saloon one more time, seeing nothing but hostile faces and closed hearts. Then he reached out and took Keene's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Keene," he whispered. As they walked toward the door, Mayor Dunlop called out, "You're making a mistake, stranger. That boy is trouble. Mark my words, you'll regret this decision." Keene paused at the threshold and looked back. "Maybe, but I'd rather regret helping someone than regret turning my back on a child in need." Outside, the evening air felt cleaner, less oppressive. Eli walked beside Keene in silence, occasionally glancing up at the man who'd just changed his life. "Mr. Keene," Eli said finally. "Yeah? Why did you help me? Everyone else thinks I'm cursed." Keene was quiet for a long moment, memories of his own dark past flickering through his mind. "Because, son, I know what it's like to be blamed for things that aren't your fault. And because sometimes the only way to fight the darkness is to choose to be a light." As they walked toward Keene's horse, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street, a man with cold eyes and a calculating smile who'd been very interested in their conversation. The real game was just beginning. The abandoned cabin sat 3 miles outside Dodge City, hidden among a grove of cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade from the relentless Kansas sun. Wyatt Keene had found it 2 days earlier while scouting the area, a forgotten homestead whose previous owners had either died or moved on, leaving behind only weathered wood and broken dreams. "It's not much," Keene said as he pushed open the creaking door, "but it's shelter." Eli Porter stepped inside cautiously, his young eyes taking in the sparse interior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney promising warmth when the prairie winds turned cold. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through gaps in the wooden walls. "It's perfect," Eli whispered, and Keene could hear the genuine gratitude in his voice. Over the past 3 days since leaving the saloon, Keene had watched the boy carefully. Eli was quiet, almost ghostly in his movements, as if he'd learned to make himself invisible to avoid trouble. But there was something else, an intelligence in his dark eyes that suggested he saw more than most people gave him credit for. "Tell me about these troubles that started when you came to town," Keene said, settling down on a wooden crate that served as a chair. He'd built a small fire, and the smell of coffee filled the cabin. Eli's face went pale. "You believe them? That I'm cursed?" "No, son. But I think you might know more about what's really happening than anyone realizes." The boy was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I see things, Mr. Keene. Things that happen at night when everyone else is sleeping." "What kind of things?" "A man. He rides out to the ranches when it's dark. He's got cold eyes like winter ice, and he moves like a shadow." Eli's hands trembled slightly. "I followed him once. I saw him pour something into the Morrison well." Keene leaned forward, his interest sharpened. "You saw someone poison the well?" Eli nodded. "And I saw him set fire to the Henderson barn. He used some kind of oil, spread it around real careful-like, then lit it with a torch. Did you recognize him? It was too dark, and he kept his face covered. But he was tall, and he rode a black horse with white markings on its legs." Keene felt a chill run down his spine. Someone was deliberately causing the troubles in Dodge City, and they were using Eli as a scapegoat. But why? "Eli, why didn't you tell anyone what you saw?" The boy's laugh was bitter beyond his years. "Who would believe me? I'm just the cursed orphan boy. Besides, I was scared. If he knew I'd seen him..." "You think he might hurt you?" "I think he might do worse than that." Before Keene could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air. Both of them froze, listening to the thunder of hoofbeats growing closer. "Stay here," Keene ordered, drawing his Colt .45 as he moved to the window. Through a gap in the wooden shutters, he could see 6 riders approaching the cabin. Even in the fading light, he recognized Sheriff Jonas Fry leading the group. Behind him rode Mayor Dunlop, his daughter Clara, and 3 other men Keene didn't recognize. "Wyatt Keene!" Fry called out as the group reined in their horses about 30 yards from the cabin. "We need to talk." Keene stepped outside, his gun still drawn but pointed toward the ground. "Sheriff, didn't expect a social call." "This isn't social," Fry replied, his hand resting on his own weapon. "There's been another incident. The church was vandalized last night, and Reverend Matthews swears he saw that boy running away from the scene." "That's impossible," Keene said. "Eli's been with me all night." Clara Dunlop urged her horse forward, her face twisted with grief and rage. "You're lying. You're protecting him because you don't know what he really is." "And what is he, Miss Dunlop?" "Evil," she spat. "Pure evil. Ever since he came to town, everything's gone wrong. And now my brother..." Her voice broke, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Mayor Dunlop moved his horse closer to his daughter's, his face grim. "Mr. Keene, I appreciate your desire to help the boy, but you're putting the entire town at risk. People are scared. They want him gone." "Or what?" Keene asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or they'll take matters into their own hands," one of the other men said. Keene recognized him as Samuel Morrison, the rancher whose cattle had gone missing. "We've been patient long enough." "Patient?" Keene's voice rose. "You call terrorizing a child patience?" "That's no child," Morrison snarled. "That's a demon sent to destroy us all." Sheriff Fry held up his hand for silence. "Mr. Keene, I'm trying to keep the peace here, but if you don't turn the boy over to us, I can't guarantee his safety. Or yours." Keene felt his blood run cold. "Are you threatening me, Sheriff? I'm warning you. There are forces at work here that you don't understand." "Then help me understand," Keene said. "Tell me about Thomas Dunlop." When exactly did he disappear? The question seemed to catch everyone off guard. Clara's face went white, and her father's expression darkened. "What does that have to do with anything?" Dunlop asked. "Humor me." Sheriff Fry shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Thomas disappeared 5 nights ago. He was last seen heading out to check on some cattle that had wandered off. And his body was never found?" "No," Clara whispered. "We searched everywhere. It's like he just vanished." Keene filed that information away. "And you're certain Eli was in town that night?" "Of course he was," Morrison shouted. "The boy's been nothing but trouble since he arrived." "Actually," Sheriff Fry said slowly, "I'm not sure where the boy was that night. We've been so focused on the other incidents." Mayor Dunlop shot the sheriff a sharp look. "Jonas, what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we should investigate this properly instead of jumping to conclusions." "There's nothing to investigate," Clara screamed. "That boy is cursed and he's destroyed my family." She spurred her horse forward suddenly, pulling a small pistol from her coat. "I'll end this myself!" Keene raised his gun, but before he could fire, Eli appeared in the cabin doorway. "Please don't hurt Mr. Keene," the boy cried out. "If you want to blame someone, blame me. But he's just trying to help." Clara's hand shook as she pointed the gun at Eli. "You killed my brother, you little monster." "I didn't." Eli's voice cracked with emotion. "I would never hurt anyone. I know what it's like to lose family." "Liar!" "Clara, stop." Mayor Dunlop reached for his daughter's arm, but she pulled away. "I saw your brother that night," Eli said suddenly, his voice barely audible. Everyone froze. Clara's gun wavered in her grip. "What did you say?" she whispered. "I saw Thomas. He was riding hard, like he was running from something. Or someone." "You're lying," Clara said, but her voice lacked conviction. "He was scared," Eli continued. "Real scared. And there was someone following him. The same man I've been seeing around town. The one with the cold eyes." Sheriff Fry leaned forward in his saddle. "Boy, are you saying you witnessed Thomas Dunlop being pursued?" Eli nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I tried to warn him, but he couldn't hear me. I was too far away, and then they both disappeared into the darkness, and I never saw either of them again." Clara's gun dropped to her side as she stared at Eli in shock. You saw someone chasing my brother?" "Yes, ma'am. And I think that same person is the one causing all the trouble in town. He's been using me as a way to cover his tracks." Mayor Dunlop's face had gone ashen. "This is impossible. Who would want to hurt Thomas?" "Someone who benefits from the chaos," Keene said quietly. "Someone who gains power when the town is afraid and looking for someone to blame." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sheriff Fry's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, his eyes scanning the group. "Now hold on," he said carefully. "Let's not start making accusations without proof." "The boy's proof enough for me," Morrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Clara holstered her pistol, her face crumpling with confusion and grief. "I don't know what to believe anymore." "Believe in the truth," Keene said. "And the truth is that someone in Dodge City is playing a very dangerous game, using fear and superstition to cover their tracks." As if summoned by his words, the sound of a single horse approaching echoed through the evening air. All heads turned to see a lone rider emerging from the shadows, a tall man on a black horse with distinctive white markings on its legs. Eli gasped and grabbed Keene's arm. "That's him," he whispered urgently. "That's the man I've been seeing." The rider stopped just beyond the circle of horses, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. When he spoke, his voice was smooth as silk and cold as winter. "Well, well," he said. "Looks like we have ourselves a little gathering." Sheriff Fry's hand tightened on his gun. "Who are you, stranger?" The man tilted his head, and in the dying light, Keene caught a glimpse of pale eyes that seemed to reflect the darkness itself. "Someone who's been watching this town very carefully," the stranger replied, "and someone who's very interested in that boy." He pointed directly at Eli, who shrank back against Keene's side. "The question is," the stranger continued, his voice carrying a threat that made everyone's blood run cold, "are you going to hand him over peacefully, or do we need to discuss this further?" The standoff had begun, and Keene realized that everything they thought they knew about Dodge City's troubles was about to change forever. The stranger's pale eyes seemed to glow in the gathering darkness as he sat motionless on his black horse. The white markings on the animal's legs were exactly as Eli had described, and Wyatt Keene felt his blood turn to ice as he realized they were face to face with the real architect of Dodge City's troubles. "I asked you a question," the stranger said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Are you going to hand over the boy, or do we need to make this unpleasant?" Sheriff Jonas Fry shifted nervously in his saddle, his hand hovering over his gun. "Now hold on there, mister. I don't know who you are, but you can't just ride up here making demands." The stranger's laugh was like the sound of wind through a graveyard. "Can't I, Sheriff? I think you'll find that I can do whatever I please in this town." Mayor Raymond Dunlop urged his horse forward, his face flushed with indignation. "See here, I'm the mayor of Dodge City, and I demand to know who you are and what business you have with that boy." "Your business is concluded, Mayor," the stranger replied with chilling calm. "You've served your purpose admirably. The town is afraid, divided, ready to tear itself apart. All that remains is to collect what's mine." Keene stepped protectively in front of Eli, his Colt .45 steady in his hand. "The boy isn't going anywhere with you." "Ah, the noble cowboy," the stranger mused. "Wyatt Keene, isn't it? The man who lost everything in Colorado 3 years ago. Wife, daughter, ranch, all burned to ash because you trusted the wrong people." Keene's jaw tightened, but he didn't lower his weapon. "How do you know about that?" "I make it my business to know about men like you. Broken men, guilty men, men who think they can find redemption by saving someone else." The stranger's smile was predatory. "But you can't save this boy, Mr. Keene. Just like you couldn't save your family." "Stop it," Eli whispered, his small hand gripping Keene's coat. "Don't listen to him, Mr. Keene. He's trying to hurt you." The stranger's attention shifted to Eli, and his expression softened into something almost paternal, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "Hello, Eli," he said gently. "You've been very troublesome, haven't you? Running away, hiding, making me chase you all across Kansas." "I don't know you," Eli said, but his voice shook with fear. "Oh, but you do. Think back, boy. Think back to the night your parents died." Eli's face went white as a sheet. "They died of fever. The doctor said what I paid him to say." The stranger's voice remained conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "Your parents didn't die of fever, Eli. They died because they discovered something they shouldn't have. Something about a certain mining operation in Colorado. Something about stolen silver and murdered families." Keene felt the pieces of a horrific puzzle beginning to fall into place. "You son of a bitch! You killed my family." "I killed many families, Mr. Keene. It was necessary to cover the tracks of a very profitable enterprise. Your family, the Porters, the Hendersons in New Mexico, the Clarks in Arizona, all unfortunate casualties of business." Clara Dunlop had been listening in growing horror. "What are you talking about? What does any of this have to do with my brother?" The stranger turned his cold gaze on her. "Your brother, my dear, discovered something he shouldn't have. He found evidence of my operations hidden in your father's office. Poor Thomas thought he was being a good citizen by investigating. Instead, he signed his own death warrant." Mayor Dunlop's face had gone ashen. "Thomas is dead? Very dead. And buried where no one will ever find him." The stranger's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing livestock prices. Just like all the others who got too close to the truth. Sheriff Fry finally found his voice. "You're confessing to murder." "I'm stating facts, Sheriff. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The answer came in the form of Fry drawing his gun, but the stranger was faster. A shot rang out across the prairie, and the sheriff tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. "Jonas!" Mayor Dunlop cried out, but the stranger's voice cut through his concern like a blade. "Anyone else feeling heroic tonight?" The other men sat frozen in their saddles, suddenly understanding that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a cursed child. "Now then," the stranger continued, holstering his smoking pistol with practiced ease. "Let's discuss terms. The boy comes with me, and the rest of you ride back to town and forget this conversation ever happened." "Why?" Keene demanded. "What do you want with Eli?" "The boy is the last witness to my Colorado operation. His parents kept records, you see, very detailed records, and before they died, they told their son where those records are hidden." Eli shook his head frantically. "I don't know anything about any records. Perhaps not consciously," the stranger agreed, "but the information is in there somewhere, and I have methods of extracting it." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Keene felt rage building in his chest like a prairie fire. "You're not taking him," he said flatly. "Mr. Keene, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Keene's voice rose. "You murdered my wife and daughter, and you want me to be reasonable? I want you to be smart. Walk away and you live to fight another day. Interfere, and you'll join them in whatever afterlife you believe in." That's when Clara Dunlop did something that surprised everyone. She pulled out her pistol again, but this time she pointed it at the stranger. "You killed my brother," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Miss Dunlop, please," her father pleaded. "Put the gun down." "No, father, this monster has destroyed our family. He's destroyed this whole town." The stranger regarded her with mild interest. "You have spirit. I'll give you that. But you're making a mistake. The only mistake was trusting people like you exist in God's creation." She pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, but it was the signal everyone had been waiting for. Chaos erupted as horses reared and men shouted. Keene grabbed Eli and dove for cover behind a fallen log as bullets began flying. "Stay down," he ordered the boy, then returned fire at the stranger who had taken cover behind his horse. Mayor Dunlop was trying to help the wounded sheriff while Morrison and the other men scattered, looking for cover. Clara had dismounted and was advancing on the stranger's position, firing methodically. "You can't hide forever," she shouted. "Thomas deserves justice." The stranger's response was to put a bullet through her shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. "Clara!" her father cried out. Keene used the distraction to move closer to the stranger's position. But as he did, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. More riders approaching from the direction of town. At least a dozen men, all armed, all riding hard toward the cabin. "Eli," he called back to the boy, "we need to move, now!" But when he looked back, Eli was gone. Panic shot through Keene like lightning. He spun around, searching frantically, and finally spotted the boy running toward the stranger's position. "Stop!" Eli shouted, his young voice carrying across the battlefield. "Stop hurting people because of me!" The stranger looked up in surprise as the 11-year-old boy approached with his hands raised. "I'll come with you," Eli said, tears streaming down his face. "Just stop hurting people, please." "Eli, no!" Keene started to run toward them, but the stranger had already grabbed the boy and hauled him up onto his horse. "A wise decision, young man," the stranger said, "though it comes a bit late." He spurred his horse toward the approaching riders, and Keene realized with growing horror that they weren't townspeople coming to help. They were the stranger's men, arriving to finish what their boss had started. "Everyone down!" Keene shouted, but his warning was lost in the thunder of hoofbeats and gunfire. The new arrivals spread out in a practiced formation, surrounding the cabin and the scattered defenders. Keene found himself pinned down behind the log, watching helplessly as the stranger and Eli disappeared into the darkness. "Let them go!" the stranger's voice called out over the gunfire. "They've served their purpose. The boy is all that matters now." As quickly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. The sound of retreating horses faded into the distance, leaving behind only the moans of the wounded and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Keene emerged from cover to find Clara Dunlop sitting against a tree, clutching her wounded shoulder. Her father was kneeling beside Sheriff Fry, who was still breathing but unconscious. "They took him," Clara said, her voice hollow with defeat. "They took Eli." Keene holstered his gun and walked over to his horse. "Not for long." "Where are you going?" Mayor Dunlop asked. "To get the boy back. You can't face them alone. There were at least a dozen men." Keene swung up into his saddle, his face set with grim determination. Maybe, but I've got something they don't. What's that? Nothing left to lose. As he rode off into the night, following the trail left by the stranger's gang, Keene thought about the boy who had trusted him enough to sacrifice himself for others. Eli Porter had shown more courage in his 11 years than most men managed in a lifetime. Now it was time for Keene to prove himself worthy of that trust. The hunt was on, and this time Wyatt Keene was determined to be the hunter, not the hunted. Behind him, the lights of Dodge City flickered in the distance like dying stars, and ahead lay only darkness and the promise of a reckoning that was 3 years in the making. The abandoned silver mine sat like a wound in the earth, its entrance yawning black against the pre-dawn sky. Wyatt Keene crouched behind a boulder 50 yards away, studying the layout through the growing light. He'd tracked the stranger's gang here through the night, following a trail of hoofprints and broken branches that led deep into the Kansas Badlands. Smoke rose from a campfire near the mine entrance, and Keene could see at least 8 men moving around the camp. The stranger's black horse was tethered with the others, but there was no sign of Eli. Keene's jaw tightened as he remembered the boy's terrified face when the stranger had grabbed him. Eli had sacrificed himself to save others, just like Keene's daughter Sarah might have done if she'd had the chance. The parallel cut deep, reopening wounds that had never properly healed. A sound behind him made Keene spin around, his hand moving to his gun. But instead of an enemy, he found Sheriff Jonas Fry approaching on foot, his left arm in a makeshift sling. "Sheriff," Keene whispered, "what are you doing here?" "Same thing you are," Fry replied, settling down beside him. "That boy saved my life back there. When Clara started shooting, he could have run. Instead, he gave himself up to protect us. You should be in town, getting that shoulder looked at. Doc Patterson patched me up well enough. Besides, I've got a job to finish." Fry's expression was grim. "I've been sheriff of Dodge City for 8 years, and I let fear and superstition cloud my judgment. That boy deserved protection, not persecution." Keene studied the older man's face and saw genuine remorse there. "How many men did you bring?" "Just me. Figured too many riders would be spotted." "Against 8 armed men? That's suicide." "Maybe, but sometimes a man has to choose between dying with honor or living with shame." Fry checked his weapon with his good hand. "What's your plan?" Before Keene could answer, a new voice cut through the morning air, young, defiant, and achingly familiar. "I told you, I don't know anything about any records." Both men turned toward the mine entrance, where they could now see Eli being dragged out by 2 of the stranger's men. The boy's hands were tied behind his back, and there was a fresh bruise on his cheek, but his spirit seemed unbroken. The stranger emerged from the mine behind them, his pale eyes cold with frustration. "Your parents were very thorough in their documentation, boy. They recorded every detail of my mining operations, every family that was eliminated, every official that was bought. Those records could destroy me." "Even if I knew where they were, I'd never tell you," Eli shot back. The stranger backhanded him casually, sending the boy sprawling in the dust. "Your defiance is admirable but pointless. I have ways of making people remember things they'd rather forget." He gestured to one of his men, who produced a set of metal instruments that glinted ominously in the firelight. Keene felt his blood turn to ice. He'd seen similar tools used by Apache raiders in Arizona, implements designed to extract information through pain. No child should ever face such horror. "We go now," he whispered to Fry. "Wait," the sheriff replied. "We need a better plan than charging in with guns blazing." But Keene was already moving, his mind focused on a single objective, getting to Eli before those instruments could be used. He'd failed to save his own daughter from the flames that consumed his ranch, but he wouldn't fail this boy. He made it halfway to the camp before one of the sentries spotted him. "Boss, we got company!" The camp erupted into chaos as men scrambled for weapons. Keene dove behind a pile of mining equipment as bullets whined overhead, his Colt .45 barking in response. "Kill the cowboy," the stranger shouted, "but keep the boy alive." Sheriff Fry opened fire from his position, his shots carefully placed to provide cover for Keene's advance. Despite his wounded arm, the lawman's aim was true, and two of the stranger's men went down in quick succession. Keene used the distraction to move closer to where Eli was being held. The boy had rolled behind a wooden crate, trying to make himself as small a target as possible. "Eli!" Keene called out. "Stay down!" "Mr. Keene!" The boy's voice was filled with desperate hope. "You came for me!" "Always, son. Always." The stranger appeared from behind the mine entrance, a rifle in his hands. "How touching," he sneered. "The broken cowboy playing hero one more time. Tell me, Keene, will this end the same way as Colorado, with everyone you care about dead?" Rage flared in Keene's chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Anger made men careless, and he couldn't afford to be careless with Eli's life at stake. "The only one dying today is you," Keene replied, putting a bullet through the stranger's rifle stock and sending the weapon spinning from his hands. "You think killing me will bring back your family?" The stranger laughed. "You think saving this boy will wash the blood from your hands?" "Maybe not," Keene admitted, advancing steadily. "But it's a start." The stranger drew his pistol, but Sheriff Fry's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. As he fell, he grabbed Eli and pressed his gun to the boy's head. "Drop your weapons," he commanded, "or the boy dies." Keene froze, his gun trained on the stranger but unable to fire without risking Eli's life. The remaining gang members had taken cover, their weapons also trained on the two lawmen. "You're outnumbered and outgunned," the stranger continued, blood seeping through his shirt. "Surrender now, and I might let you live long enough to watch me extract the information I need from the boy." "Don't do it, Mr. Keene," Eli called out. "He's going to kill us anyway." The stranger pressed the gun harder against Eli's temple. "Shut up, boy." That's when Keene heard something that made his heart leap, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. A lot of them. The stranger heard it too, his eyes widening with alarm. "What?" Mayor Raymond Dunlop appeared over the ridge, leading a group of 20 armed men from Dodge City. Clara rode beside her father despite her wounded shoulder, her face set with determination. "Citizens of Dodge City!" Dunlop called out as the riders spread out around the mine. "You're surrounded! Release the boy and surrender!" The stranger's face twisted with rage. "Impossible! The town was supposed to tear itself apart. The town came together," Clara shouted back. "When we learned the truth about what you did to my brother, to all those families, we decided to stop running from our fears and start fighting back." Sheriff Fry took advantage of the distraction to move closer. "It's over," he told the stranger. "You're outnumbered 20-1. It's not over until I say it's over," the stranger snarled. He started to pull the trigger, but Eli suddenly threw himself backward, knocking the gun off target. The shot went wild, and Keene didn't hesitate. His bullet took the stranger center mass, sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader fall and facing overwhelming odds, threw down their weapons. Keene rushed to Eli's side, cutting the ropes that bound the boy's hands. "Are you hurt?" Eli threw his arms around Keene's neck, tears streaming down his face. "I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't leave me." "Never," Keene whispered, holding the boy close. "I'll never leave you." As the townspeople secured the surviving gang members, Sheriff Fry knelt beside the dying stranger. "What was your real name?" he asked. The man's pale eyes were already growing dim. "Does it matter? There are others like me. The corruption runs deeper than you know." "Maybe," Fry replied, "but not in Dodge City. Not anymore." The stranger's final breath rattled in his throat, and then he was still. Clara Dunlop approached Keene and Eli, her expression soft with regret. "I owe you both an apology," she said. "I let my grief blind me to the truth. You were hurting," Eli said simply. "People do bad things when they're hurting, but you came to help when it mattered." Clara knelt down to the boy's level. "My brother would have liked you, Eli Porter. He always stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves." Mayor Dunlop joined them, his face showing the weight of recent events. "Mr. Keene, the town owes you a debt we can never repay. And Eli, We owe you the biggest apology of all. What happens now? Eli asked, looking up at Keene with trusting eyes. Keene felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the guilt and pain he'd carried for 3 years. He'd spent so long running from his past that he'd forgotten how to build a future. Now we go home, he said. Home? Dodge City, if they'll have us. I hear they might need a new deputy sheriff. He looked at Sheriff Fry, who nodded with a smile. And I hear there's a good school in town, Clara added. Every boy deserves an education. As they rode back toward Dodge City, the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the shadows that had plagued the town for so long. Eli rode beside Keene, chattering excitedly about everything he wanted to learn and do. For the first time in 3 years, Wyatt Keene allowed himself to hope. He couldn't bring back his wife and daughter, but he could honor their memory by protecting this boy who had shown him that redemption was possible. The curse of Dodge City had been broken, not by driving away an innocent child, but by a community learning to face its fears together. And in saving Eli Porter, Wyatt Keene had finally saved himself. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.